They mounted a motorized arm inside your car door and aimed it at your neck every time you buckled up. Back then, automakers were so desperate to solve the seatbelt problem that they invented solutions worse than the problem itself. Here are 30 funny car features from the 1980s that made absolutely no sense. Motorized automatic seatbelts arrived in American cars in the early 1980s as one of the stranger compromises in automotive history. Seatbelt use sat at roughly 7% nationally, so engineers designed a shoulder belt on a track inside the door frame. Close the door, and a small electric motor whirred the belt across your chest. The Toyota Camry, Honda Civic, and Nissan Sentra all used versions of this system. The problem was that the motorized belt only covered the shoulder. The lap belt remained separate and manual, and many drivers never clipped it. In a frontal crash, the unanchored lower body slid forward under the shoulder strap. Engineers called it submarining, and it drove the restraint point from the chest toward the throat. One Honda and Mitsubishi variation mounted both restraint points on the door panel itself, so a door forced open in a crash took the entire belt with it. These systems were phased out in the early 1990s when airbags finally took over. Chrysler's electronic voice alert, introduced on K-car-based models, including the New Yorker and LeBaron, ran on the same Texas Instruments speech chip used in the toy Speak and Spell. Start the engine, and a synthesized male voice confirmed all monitored systems were functioning. Leave your keys in, and it told you not to forget them. Fail to close a door, and it announced that a door is ajar, a phrase that became the shorthand for 80s automotive ambition. The system delivered 11 different spoken warnings and lowered the radio before speaking. Owners who pulled the fuse discovered it also disabled the fuel gauge on early models. Chrysler's fix was a shut-off switch in the glove box. Meanwhile, Nissan had built a competing system for the 1981 Datsun Maxima that used a tiny, shock-proof phonograph record spinning inside the dashboard because a speech chip apparently was not sufficiently strange. Digital dashboards swept through American car design in the early 1980s with total certainty that analog gauges were finished. Knight Rider, which premiered in 1982, featured a talking car whose dashboard glowed like a slot machine, and Detroit took notes. The Pontiac Firebird, the Chevrolet Corvette, the Buick Berlinetta, and the Cadillac DeVille all offered digital instrument clusters. Instead of a needle sweeping a dial, you got numbers changing too fast to read on a freeway ramp. Instead of a tachometer, you got horizontal bars of glowing rectangles that looked more like a pocket calculator than a precision instrument. Analog gauges drifted or stuck. Digital clusters went dark all at once, taking speed, fuel, and temperature with them. Drivers of early 80s Corvettes sometimes had no working instruments for the rest of a drive. Most manufacturers abandoned the all-digital dash before 1990. The future had arrived briefly, and then the circuit board gave out. T-tops defined American performance cars through the late 1970s and well into the 80s, appearing on the Camaro, Firebird, Mustang, and Monte Carlo. Lift out the two glass or fiberglass roof panels, and you had something like a convertible for an afternoon. On most Camaros and Firebirds, the T-top was the most commonly checked option box. Removing those panels gutted the roof's torsional stiffness, and T-top cars flexed and creaked over rough pavement in ways the hardtop never did. The panels leaked at the seams, cracked in summer heat, and were routinely stolen from parking lots because there was no practical way to lock them. By the mid-80s, most had developed a steady drip onto the driver's left shoulder during rain. General Motors discontinued T-tops in most G-body cars in 1987. Pop-up retractable headlights were the signature look of anything meant to seem fast in the 80s, like the Firebird, the Fiero, the Mazda RX-7, and the Dodge Daytona. Vacuum or electric actuators kept the lights behind flush panels, and they rotated upward when switched on. In the showroom, the effect was dramatic. On the road, the mechanisms proved deeply unreliable. Vacuum actuators cracked and lost pressure, leaving lights stuck at odd angles. Electric motors seized. Cold temperatures made the actuators sluggish or unresponsive for minutes after startup. On the Pontiac Fiero, owners discovered that above roughly 120 miles per hour, aerodynamic lift was sufficient to force the headlight doors open on their own, regardless of the switch position. A failed pop-up assembly cost between $150 and $300 to fix in the mid-80s. Real money spent restoring a mechanism whose entire purpose was to make the front of the car look sleeker when parked. By the time the CB radio craze peaked between 1975 and 1979, it had reached far enough into mainstream culture that American manufacturers were listing factory-installed CB radios as legitimate luxury options. C.W. McCall's Convoy topped both the pop and country charts in January of 1976. Smokey and the Bandit in 1977 outgrossed everything that year except Star Wars. The result was Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors all offering factory CB packages at $250 to $400 on cars from the Pontiac Trans Am to Buick station wagons. A chrome antenna rose from the trunk lid. The unit required learning a vocabulary of 10 codes to use it all. By 1983, the craze was dead. The buyers still making payments had a $400 factory option that was now archaeology, impossible to remove without leaving a hole in the dashboard. Long before convertibles came back within reach of regular buyers, automakers found a cheaper way to sell the feeling. The fake convertible top, marketed as the cabriolet roof or Landau top, was vinyl or padded fabric stretched over the rear portion of a hardtop roof to suggest the car had once been open to the sky. Lee Iacocca reportedly required the treatment on multiple Chrysler and Dodge models, despite objections from design teams. The chief designer of the Dodge Murata was overruled on the Landau roof specifically. Chrysler also sold a cabriolet roof variant with a blocked rear quarter window, simulating a folded top on a car that was a structural hardtop in every sense. The hidden cost was corrosion. Vinyl roofs trapped moisture against the metal beneath, and in freeze-thaw climates, the water worked under the seams for years before any evidence appeared on the surface. The luxury trim option some buyers paid extra for was quietly dissolving the top of their shell from above, invisible until the rust bloomed through. Opera windows, small decorative fixed panes set into the vinyl C-pillar of American luxury cars, originated in horse-drawn carriages around 1915, where they let passengers look out without lowering the roof. Lincoln revived them on the Continental Mark IV in 1972, and within a few years they appeared on the Chrysler Cordoba, the Dodge Murata, the Ford Thunderbird, and the Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. They were entirely fixed and non-opening, shaped as ovals or circles with no geometric relation to the surrounding glass. Their function in a carriage had been to provide visibility. Their function in an 80s hardtop was ornamental, and their actual effect on driver visibility was negative. They occupied precisely the C-pillar's own driver's check when reversing or changing lanes, replacing usable glass with a decorative shape that admitted light but communicated nothing useful about what was alongside or behind the car. The 8-track tape player arrived as a factory option in American cars in 1966, introduced by Ford. It spent 15 years as the dominant in-car audio format before the cassette made it obsolete. Through the early 80s, 8 tracks were still being installed in new cars and still providing the same experience, including one feature no engineering ever eliminated, the mid-song program change. Click. 8-track cartridges divided content across 4 programs. When one ended, a loud mechanical click interrupted the music wherever it fell. On a quiet ballad, it arrived at the softest moment. Heat made things worse. Parked in a summer car, the magnetic tape softened and warped, producing a wavering flutter in playback pitch. Ford stopped offering 8 tracks in 1982. The click remained perfect until the end. But before the carburetor era finally closed, the word turbo became the most powerful term in American automotive marketing, whether or not the engine underneath had ever seen a turbocharger. Chrysler's Conquest TSI wore the model name in enormous letters across the full width of its rear hatch. The Dodge Daytona Turbo Z carried its name in script, readable from a following car at freeway speed. Some models carried turbo boost gauges in the instrument cluster, small dials measuring pounds of manifold pressure, even when the engine was a naturally aspirated 4-cylinder that produced boost of exactly 0. Aftermarket shops in every city sold turbo decal kits so owners could apply the word to cars with no turbocharger in their history. Fake hood scoops and non-functional vents completed the theater. The decade did not invent the gap between automotive self-promotion and mechanical reality. It committed to that gap with a consistency the world had not seen before. In the summer of 1973, NHTSA required all new American cars to include an ignition interlock, preventing the engine from starting unless front seat occupants had buckled their seatbelts. Studies showed the device increased belt use by roughly 40%. Congress received more complaint letters about the interlock than about Nixon's Saturday Night Massacre. The House voted 339 to 49 to eliminate it in 1974, less than 12 months after it took effect. The same legislation barred NHTSA from ever requiring interlocks again and capped the seatbelt warning buzzer at 8 seconds. Accounts from Capitol Hill suggest Ford's lobbyists effectively drafted the amendment. Owners of 1974 cars were expressly permitted by the new law to disable their working interlock systems at home. A safety device proven 40% effective was removed from every new American car because drivers found it inconvenient to buckle before turning the key. The passive motorized seatbelt, the belt that moved on a track along the doorframe and wrapped itself around you automatically, became the standard American passive restraint through the late 80s, appearing in the Toyota Camry, Honda Civic, Nissan Sentra, and dozens of others. Manufacturers chose it over airbags because it cost less. The mechanism only covered the shoulder. The lap belt remained manual and separate, and a significant number of drivers never clipped it. In a frontal crash, the unanchored lower body slid forward under the shoulder strap, the submarine effect, with the restraint point migrating toward the throat. A Honda and Mitsubishi variation mounted both attachment points on the door itself, so a door forced open in a crash took the restraint with it. The systems were phased out in the early 90s as airbags became standard. For a full decade, drivers trusted a mechanism that worked in most crashes and in the crashes where it did not. The design gap was the reason. The Pontiac Fiero arrived in 1984 as GM's first mid-engine production car, a 2-seat sports coupe with plastic body panels and genuine Italian-inspired proportions. It also arrived with a 2.5-liter engine carrying the nickname the Iron Duke, only 3 quarts of oil capacity, and a connecting rod that under certain conditions would punch through the side of the block. When a rod failed, the oil hit the exhaust manifold and ignited. GM was aware of the problem by 1986 when NHTSA opened an investigation. Rather than recall the cars, Pontiac treated engine fires as warranty claims and, according to journalists Joseph White and Paul Ingrassia, required customers to sign non-disclosure agreements before receiving compensation. GM recalled all 136,000 1984 Fieros on the evening before Thanksgiving in 1987. Timed, observers noted, for minimum press coverage. A second recall covering all model years followed in 1990. The car was discontinued in 1988. The 1982 Chevrolet Corvette launched with what General Motors called Crossfire injection, twin throttle body injectors mounted facing each other across the intake manifold. The system produced 190 horsepower. The previous Corvette, with a conventional carburetor, also produced 190 horsepower. 2 years of engineering and significant production cost had delivered exactly 0 additional power. The arrangement of facing injectors created intake turbulence that worked against itself. Throttle response was worse than a well-tuned carburetor, and the system was difficult to diagnose and repair. General Motors dropped Crossfire after 1984 and replaced it with the tuned port injection system, which actually worked. The 2 Crossfire years remain a footnote in fuel injection history, proof that pointing 2 things at each other is not better than pointing 1 thing in the right direction. If Crossfire injection was General Motors confusing its own engineering, power retractable radio antennas were the industry confusing luxury with complexity. From the late 70s through the mid-80s, a fully automatic power antenna was a genuine status symbol. It rose from the rear fender when you switched on the radio and retracted when you switched it off. The motor hummed, the chrome sections extended one by one, and for roughly 30 seconds, you felt like you were in a serious car. The weak point was the nylon rack the motor used to drive the sections. It wore down, stripped, and failed on a reliable schedule. The antenna then locked in the fully extended position. If you drove through a car wash with the antenna up, the rotating brushes snapped it at the base, leaving a chrome stub and a repair bill of $150 to $200. Replacement antennas were aftermarket items of varying quality, and every one of them eventually failed the same way. Fixed short mast antennas made the category irrelevant by the late 80s. Vinyl Landau roofs were sold as luxury upgrades, adding several $100s to the window sticker of American luxury and personal luxury cars. The brochures did not mention that the vinyl required regular maintenance to prevent it from trapping moisture against the sheet metal beneath. Almost nobody maintained it. The vinyl dried and cracked at the seams, creating channels where rain collected directly against bare metal. In northern climates, that water froze and thawed through each winter. The corrosion that followed was invisible from outside, hidden under the intact center sections of the vinyl, and by the time it appeared on the surface, it had usually consumed significant portions of the roof panel. Body shops did steady business cutting rusted roof sections from cars whose owners had no idea what was happening under the vinyl. That hidden rust often meant expensive repairs. Hood ornaments, the chrome figures and crests bolted to the leading edge of American car hoods, had been a domestic design fixture since the 1920s, and American manufacturers were still fitting them to new cars well into the 80s. The Cadillac wreath and crest ornament, the Lincoln Star, and various Buick and Chrysler crests remained standard equipment through the decade. European safety regulators had by this point identified them as pedestrian impact hazards. A rigid chrome projection at hood height would transfer force directly to a pedestrian's head or torso at low speed. West Germany and several other markets required retractable or breakaway designs, but American regulators did not. Domestic hood ornaments remained fixed, rigid chrome projections bolted through the hood with no yielding mechanism. In urban areas, they were also a reliable theft target. A Cadillac crest could be removed in under 30 seconds and sold at a swap meet by the weekend. The fake hood scoop, the non-functional vent, and the decorative air intake, sealed at the factory and connected to nothing, spread across American car design through the decade with no resistance from buyers, regulators, or the laws of physics. The Dodge Charger's prominent hood scoop was a decorative sheet metal shape with no airflow path to the engine beneath it. Various Mustang configurations, Pontiac Trans Ams, and dozens of other models came from the factory with prominent scoops or louvers that were either cosmetically molded or sealed shut. These components added weight, created minor aerodynamic drag, and gave drivers the impression of high-performance cooling that bore no relationship to what was happening under the hood. Aftermarket suppliers sold additional fake scoops as bolt-on accessories. No recall was ever issued. No regulator ever objected. They remain on collector cars today, inert and ornamental, exactly as designed, which was never to do anything at all. Long after most of the decade's gadgets had been abandoned, the carburetor was still showing up in new American cars. Fuel injection. Adoption began in earnest in 1982, but carbureted engines remained in economy models and base trim levels through the mid-'80s. The cold start ritual a carburetor required was personal, specific to each engine, and it had to be learned the way you learn a person's moods. On a cold morning, pump the accelerator 2 or 3 times, but not 4, because 4 flooded the engine. Wait 5 seconds after the last pump, turn the key. If it does not catch, wait. Do not pump again. A flooded carburetor in January could mean sitting still for 20 minutes. The ritual shortened in summer, but the habit stayed. Fuel injection simply started the car every time, without reference to temperature, humidity, altitude, or the specific superstitions of the previous owner. Every driver who moved from a carbureted car to a fuel-injected. One remembers the first January morning. The engine just ran. Ford had known about the problem since 1972. The automatic transmission in Ford, Lincoln, and Mercury vehicles built between 1966 and 1980 had a flaw that allowed the selector to slip from park into reverse on its own without any input from the driver. The fix cost 3 cents per car. Ford instead paid out $20 million in settlements over 8 years while the cars stayed on the road. By 1980, NHTSA had documented 777 accidents, 259 injuries, and 23 confirmed deaths across 21 million affected vehicles. A full recall would have threatened Ford's solvency. Ford's lawyers negotiated an alternative. Instead of a recall, Ford mailed owners a warning sticker for the interior. The sticker read, "Do not leave the vehicle unattended with the engine running." The 3-cent fix was never installed in a single car. No recall was ever issued for the transmission itself. The stickers are still in some of those cars today. Audi sold 75,000 cars in the United States in 1985. By 1991, that number had fallen to 12,000. The collapse began November 23, 1986. When 60 Minutes broadcast a segment alleging the Audi 5000 was prone to sudden, uncontrolled acceleration after being shifted out of park. HTSA had been receiving complaints about the Audi 5000 since the early 80s and had forced 3 separate recalls, 1982, 83, and 87. The 60 Minutes demonstration used a modified vehicle, and subsequent investigation found most incidents were likely driver error, pressing the accelerator instead of the brake. But Audi's public response was widely viewed as defensive, and the reputational damage was complete. Showrooms emptied. The Audi 5000 was renamed the Audi 100 in a rebranding attempt. The American market recovery took nearly 20 years. The broadcast is still studied in journalism schools as one of the most consequential and most contested automotive stories in the history of American television. In 1986, Buick installed the first touchscreen in a production car. The electronic control center in the Buick Riviera was a green and black cathode ray tube display that replaced conventional radio and climate controls with a touch-sensitive screen. GM Chairman Roger B. Smith had approved the project, calling it proof that Buick was a world leader in automotive electronics. The screen controlled stereo, temperature, and trip computer functions, and included a configurable overspeed alarm. Buick carried the system into the Riata Coupe when it launched in 1988. Buyers found it difficult to operate while driving. The interface frequently failed to register touch inputs, and the cathode ray tube hardware failed at rates that alarmed the warranty department. By 1989, the touchscreen was gone from the Reatta, replaced with conventional controls. The world's first production car touchscreen lasted approximately 3 model years before the company that built it decided the technology was not ready. The next mainstream production touchscreen would not arrive for roughly 15 years. Fake wood grain paneling appeared on American car interiors and station wagon exteriors throughout the late 1970s and deep into the 80s, most prominently on the Chrysler LeBaron, the Ford Country Squire wagon, and the Buick Estate wagon. The material was not wood. It was a printed vinyl or thermoplastic sheet laminated to sheet metal, manufactured to resemble burled walnut or mahogany, and priced as an option. In a real wood-paneled car from the 50s, the trim was cut from actual timber. In a 1983 LeBaron, the grain was a photograph of wood printed onto petroleum-based plastic. The laminate began peeling at the edges by the 3rd or 4th year, starting at corners where heat and cold stressed the adhesive. The peeling sections caught sunlight and turned white or tan, giving the car a blistered appearance. Replacement wood grain vinyl kits were available at auto parts stores, providing owners the opportunity to cover deteriorating fake wood with fresh fake wood. The Idiot Light dashboard replaced precise gauges with a single warning bulb per system, a cost reduction measure backed by consumer research that suggested most drivers never looked at their gauges anyway. By the early 1980s, many American economy and mid-range cars had replaced the oil pressure gauge, the temperature gauge, and the alternator gauge with small amber or red lights labeled oil, temp, and ALT. The lights came on when a problem had already progressed beyond early warning. An oil pressure light did not mean low oil. It meant that pressure had dropped low enough that engine damage was imminent or already occurring. A temperature light meant coolant was already near the boiling point, not approaching it. By the time the light appeared, the window for a low-cost fix had usually closed. Drivers who responded promptly sometimes saved their engines. Drivers who assumed the light was being dramatic or who could not stop immediately, frequently, did not. Beyond the idiot lights and the leaking T-tops, there were families carrying children in cars whose known problems had been settled rather than fixed. The manual choke lever, still standard on some American economy cars and trucks well into the 80s, required the driver to manually enrich the fuel mixture for cold starts by pulling a dashboard knob. Pull it out to choke, push it back in after 3 to 5 minutes. If you forgot to push it back in, the engine ran rich, too much fuel and not enough air, and eventually it stalled at the worst possible moment, on a cold January ramp. Drivers who had grown up with manual chokes did it without thinking. Drivers encountering one for the first time had no indication anything needed to be pushed back in, because the warning was in the owner's manual in the glove box, not on the dashboard in front of them. In 1956, Columbia Records and Chrysler partnered to offer the Highway Hi-Fi, an in-car record player mounted under the dashboard of select Chrysler, Dodge, and DeSoto models. The device used custom 16 RPM microgroove records and a heavy spring-loaded arm designed to hold the needle in the groove over road vibrations. It did not entirely work. On smooth highways it performed adequately. On anything resembling a real road, the needle skipped. Columbia discontinued the special format in 1959 after poor sales. Motorola and then RCA introduced competing in-car 45 RPM players in 1960. They also skipped. The entire experiment of spinning a vinyl disc in a moving vehicle was never solved before the 8-track tape arrived and ended the question. The last in-car record player was installed in a new American car in 1961. The sound it left behind was the tick of a skipping needle running in an empty groove on a road that never got smooth enough. Landau bars, The chrome S-shaped ornaments bolted to the C-pillars of American luxury cars had no mechanical function. They were decorative references to the iron bars that had once held the folding tops of 19th-century Landau carriages. On a 1982 Chrysler Cordoba, they were chrome hardware screwed through vinyl into metal. They looked expensive. The structural problem was identical to the Landau roof overhead. The mounting hardware created small penetrations through the vinyl and the metal beneath, and water worked into those penetrations with each rain. The bars trapped moisture at their mounting points, accelerating the cracking and separation of the vinyl above. Cars fitted with both the vinyl Landau roof and the chrome Landau bars ended up with corrosion from two directions. Water came from above through the roof seams and from the side through the pillar hardware. Owners were paying a premium because the car looked well made. The seatbelt warning buzzer that replaced the ignition interlock in 1974 was designed to be short enough that drivers would not object. The legislation capped it at 8 seconds. Automakers complied by installing buzzers that were reliably ignorable. Many drivers learned to pull the belt out just far enough to silence the sensor and tuck it behind them unfastened, a workaround so widespread that seatbelt buckle clips became standard items at auto parts stores. The buzzer ran for a decade, while seatbelt use nationally remained below 15%. Mandatory seatbelt laws did not begin reaching American states until New York passed the first one in December of 1984. In the years between the interlock's death and the belt law's arrival, 8 seconds of buzzer was the entire American safety net, noise that stopped whether you had buckled or not. Rear window louvers, rigid ABS plastic slat covers fitted over the rear glass of American performance and sporty economy cars, blocked rear visibility entirely in exchange for the look of a racing car. They appeared on the Camaro, the Mustang, the Dodge Omni 024, and dozens of other models as factory options or dealer-installed accessories. The slats were angled to admit no useful vision through the rear glass. Drivers could see nothing through the back window, not approaching vehicles, not pedestrians, not the obstacle directly behind the car while reversing. The interior rear-view mirror became a rectangle of black plastic slats. The side mirrors, manually adjustable from inside on most cars of the era, became the only rearward reference available. No safety standard prohibited rear louvers. No recall was ever issued. They were sold by Sears, by J.C. Whitney, and at dealerships as appearance upgrades, a feature that made the car look faster by eliminating the ability to see where the car had been. By the time the 1980s ended, the cars carrying American families were being replaced, traded in, or worn out. The T-tops leaked into junkyards. The talking dashboards went silent when fuses blew. The motorized seat belts seized on their tracks. The vinyl roofs peeled back to show what the moisture had been doing underneath, quietly for years. What was left was not a record of machines that had failed. Most ran, most of the time, without incident. What was left was a record of decisions, designs chosen for appearance over reliability. Safety features stripped because they annoyed people. Known defects settled while the cars stayed on the road. The families who drove them trusted the window sticker and the brochure and the salesman. Most of them were right, most of the time. The ones who were not had no way of knowing before they found out. These cars ran. Most of them, most of the time. Drop a comment if you drove one or survived one.